Okay, so picture this. You walk into this bustling port, right? And the air, it's thick with that salty smell, and all these sounds of machinery and stuff. But get this, everything is just frozen in place. Cranes are hanging midair, like someone just hit the pause button. Forklifts are just poised there, ready to move. And you see a container ship halfway unloaded, but nothing's happening. Why? Because someone, somewhere, messed up the paperwork.
Oh, that's a nightmare scenario for any shipper.
Absolutely. And it highlights just how crucial the often overlooked world of export documentation really is. So today, we're diving deep into that world using this 2024 manual for shipping documentation workers as our guide. Have you had a chance to look through it?
Oh, yeah, and it's packed with insights, really practical stuff.
Yeah, it's like super hands-on. It walks you through all these different scenarios, almost like a choose-your-own-adventure, but for the paperwork side of shipping.
Right, which honestly is way more exciting than it sounds.
You got that right. We'll be uncovering all sorts of things. Like, what are those dreaded demurrage fees everyone's always talking about? What exactly is a telex release? And why is something called a loading list? So make or break for a shipment.
And those are just a few of the things we'll be exploring today. There's a whole ecosystem of documents and procedures that most people never even think about. But without them, global trade as we know it would just grind to a halt.
It'd be like that frozen port all over the world. So let's jump right in and put ourselves in the shoes of an export documentation executive. Our manual starts with a typical day. First things first, a shipper calls up needing an empty container.
The most basic starting point.
Right. They'll specify what size they need and, of course, where it's headed.
And even at this early stage, there's already a lot happening behind the scenes.
Oh, like what?
Well, the sales team needs to get involved. They need to confirm the tariff,
Yeah.
make sure the costs are clear for the shipper, and basically just ensure everything aligns with what they need.
So it's more than just handing over a box, basically. Okay, so then we get to the shipping order, right?
Right.
And the manual emphasizes how this is basically like the DNA of the whole shipment.
It's everything. It's not just a form. It's a legally binding document.
Yeah.
It has all the details from what's actually being shipped to the shipper's information, the consignee, everything.
So it's pretty important to get it right, I'm guessing.
Right.
And what happens if there's like even a small mistake or something's missing?
It can trigger a whole cascade of problems. The manual gives a pretty good example. Imagine you're shipping lithium batteries, but the shipping order doesn't have the IMCO classifications.
IMCO.
Yeah, it stands for International Maritime Dangerous Goods Code. Basically, it outlines how to handle dangerous goods safely.
Ah, so without those details.
You've got a major safety issue on your hands. That shipment, it could be loaded wrong, stored incorrectly. Worst case scenario, you could even have a fire or an explosion.
Oh, wow. So it's not just about delays then.
Definitely not. Beyond the safety risks, you're talking serious financial and legal implications. That shipment could get stopped at customs, which means delays, fines, and potentially even legal action.
So it's a big deal. Okay, so we've got our meticulously completed shipping order. What's next?
The next step is contacting the port. They need to confirm they've got the right size container available for the shipper.
Seems simple enough.
It is. But ports are incredibly busy places,
Yeah.
especially these days. They have limited space and huge demand, so coordinating everything is key.
Makes sense. So you don't want a shipper showing up with a truckload of stuff and no container waiting for them. Now, the manual mentions this thing called free time. What exactly is that?
Free time is the period that shippers get to pick up their container, load it up, and get it back to the port without incurring any extra charges. It's basically all about keeping things running smoothly at the port.
So it's like a grace period.
Yeah, exactly. But what happens if, let's say, a truck breaks down or the shipper's schedule suddenly changes? Do they get any wiggle room with this free time? Well, there might be some flexibility depending on the specific port and the circumstances. But generally, if you go over that free time, you're looking at what are called demurrage charges.
Demurrage. That's one of those words that always sounds a little ominous. So I guess clear communication and planning are pretty crucial here, huh?
Absolutely. Shippers need to know those deadlines.
Okay, let's fast forward a bit. The container's been picked up, loaded with those lithium batteries, and safely returned to the port. What's happening on the documentation side of things now?
Now it's the documentation team's turn to really get to work. They take all that information from the shipping order, which has been super carefully checked, and they start preparing a draft of the bill of lading.
Ah, the bill of lading. Another one of those documents that sounds simple, but I'm guessing it's more complicated than it seems.
It's actually one of the most vital documents in the entire process. It acts as a contract of carriage, or receipt for the goods, and even proof of ownership. It's multifaceted, and it literally follows the goods throughout their journey.
So it's kind of a big deal. Now, the manual really stresses the need to confirm this draft bill of lading with the shipper. Why is that so important? It seems like a lot of back and forth.
It's all about making sure everything is absolutely correct. Because even a small error on the bill of lading, like listing the wrong destination or getting the description of the goods wrong,
Oh.
could mean that shipment ends up in the wrong place, gets held up at customs, or even gets rejected by the recipient.
So a tiny typo could have massive consequences.
Huge consequences.
All
We're
over.
talking potential financial losses, damage to reputation, all because of a simple mistake.
So the shipper gets this draft and they go through it with a fine-tooth comb, looking for any discrepancies. What happens if they find something that needs to be changed?
There are procedures in place, outlined in the manual, for amending the draft. It's all about making sure any changes are properly documented and agreed upon by everyone involved.
So it's not just about catching errors, it's about having a system for fixing them too. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so our bill of lading draft is all checked and confirmed. Are we ready to set sail now?
Almost.
Hmm.
But there's one more crucial document that needs to be finalized before the final bill of lading is issued. The loading list.
Okay, the loading list. This one actually sounds pretty straightforward, just a list of everything going onto the ship, right?
It sounds simple, but it's incredibly important for accountability. The loading list verifies exactly which containers are going on which specific vessel. And it's a key step in preventing a classic shipping horror story, a container getting left behind because it wasn't properly documented.
Oh, I can only imagine how frustrating that would be. A whole container of goods just sitting on the dock because someone forgot to put it on a list.
More than frustrating, it can be a major headache. It leads to delays, extra costs, and potentially damaged relationships between the shipper, the carrier, and the port.
So even these seemingly simple documents can really throw a wrench in the works.
It's all connected. And this manual goes even deeper, exploring more of these potential pitfalls, even for experienced professionals.
Well, let's take a break here and we'll come back and dive into those common mistakes and what they can mean for a shipment. It's amazing how a single document can have such a big impact on the whole process.
Yeah, it's wild. And even with all these procedures in place, to make sure everything's accurate, mistakes still happen.
Human error, right?
Exactly. And that's actually what Chapter 4 of this manual dives into. It highlights some of the most common errors that, even seasoned professionals working in documentation can make.
It's kind of reassuring in a way, right? It's not like we're dealing with super complicated stuff here.
Well, the mistakes themselves, they're often not complicated. It's more about the context, the pressure of the job. Think about it. You're dealing with tight deadlines. You're multitasking constantly. There's just so much information to process. It's easy to see how errors slip through.
The manual actually gives some really relatable examples, like inputting the wrong port of loading or discharge. We've all accidentally typed the wrong thing in an email at some point. Right?
Oh, yeah. But in this case, that typo could mean a container ends up in Tokyo instead of Toronto. This is right. You're talking massive delays, rerouting costs, a lot of explaining to do.
Not to mention probably some pretty unhappy customers.
For sure. And then there's the financial side. Fixing a routing error like that, it's not cheap.
So it's a big deal. Another one that stuck out to me was entering the wrong weight or measurements for the cargo. I mean, does it really matter if a container is off by a few pounds?
It might seem like a small thing, but even a slight weight discrepancy can have a domino effect.
Really? Like what?
Think about it. Ships, they're loaded very precisely. It's all about maintaining balance and stability. If the weight's off, even by a bit, it can throw off the entire balance of the ship and potentially even make it unsafe.
Wow, I never thought about it that way. So it's not just about the cargo, it's about the safety of the whole ship.
Yeah, exactly. And then there are the financial penalties. Ports and customs, they've got strict rules about weight limits. And if you exceed those, you're looking at some hefty fines.
So again, a small mistake can have some pretty big consequences. The manual also talks about the importance of communicating clearly with the shipper, especially about deadlines.
Oh, absolutely. Communication is key.
I imagine if a deadline is missed, even by a day, it could cause problems.
Big problems. Remember those demurrage charges we talked about earlier? Well, if a deadline's missed, even because of miscommunication, those charges could kick in.
And no one wants to deal with that.
Nope. And it can really strain the relationship between the shipper and the documentation team too.
Makes sense. Now, this manual also gets into the kind of the human side of working in this field. It acknowledges that this is a high-pressure job with a lot of responsibility riding on getting things right.
Chapter 8, it goes into this in detail. Talks about the stress of handling multiple shipments, the constant deadlines, the potential for burnout.
Yeah, it sounds pretty intense.
It definitely can be. There's a lot to juggle.
So the manual talks about ways to manage that stress, right?
Right. Things like, stress management techniques, making sure there's good communication within the team, creating a supportive work environment.
That's good to hear. But realistically, mistakes are going to happen. Does the manual talk about how to deal with that when it inevitably does?
It does. There's a whole section dedicated to procedures for dealing with errors, how to identify them, how to rectify them.
So it's not just about preventing mistakes. It's about having a plan for when they do occur.
Exactly. And this is where having all those reports, that detailed paper trail we talked about, really comes in handy.
So all that paperwork actually has a purpose.
Absolutely. It might seem like overkill, but it can be crucial when you need to trace back, figure out where an error happened, and then take the steps to correct it.
Speaking of reports, this manual mentions a ton of them. Container release confirmations, daily shipment status reports, exception reports, performance metrics reports. It seems like a lot.
It is a lot.
Yeah.
But each report serves a purpose. Yeah, it's all about transparency, accountability, making sure things are running smoothly.
Okay, let's pick a couple to focus on. The idle container report. That one caught my eye. Why would you need a report just for containers that are just sitting around?
It's all about efficiency. Think of it like a checkup on how well the port's operating. The idle container report helps identify containers that have been sitting idle for too long, and that can point to bottlenecks in the system or areas where container management could be improved.
So it's not just about wasted space, it's about optimizing the whole flow of containers.
Exactly. Then you got the exception report, which is basically like an early warning system.
So early warning system for what?
For any deviations from the plan. Like let's say there's a customs hold or some documentation's missing or there's a schedule change. The exception report flags all that.
So it gives the team a heads up like, hey, something might be going wrong here so you can get ahead of it.
That's it. It's all about catching those potential issues early before they turn into major disruptions.
So it's like a proactive approach to problem solving.
Exactly. And, it's amazing how these reports, even the ones that seem kind of mundane, all contribute to keeping things moving.
It's like a whole ecosystem of information.
It really is.
Uh.
And it shows how vital documentation is in making sure global trade runs smoothly, that goods can move across borders without a hitch.
It's really incredible, the scale of it all, isn't it? All those goods moving around the world. It's mind-boggling.
And it's all thanks to these documents. They're the glue that holds us all together.
Now, before we wrap up, there's one more thing in this manual that really caught my attention. They've included all these simulated customer service conversations, almost like scripts for how to handle those tricky situations that documentation workers face all the time.
I thought those were fascinating, too.
Yeah.
It gives you a real sense of what it's like on the ground, all the challenges they face, the pressure they're under.
It's like a window into their world.
You see how they have to think on their feet,
Yeah.
stay calm when things get stressful, and, communicate clearly even when they're dealing with customers who might be frustrated or confused.
It really humanizes the whole process, reminds us that there are real people behind all these documents dealing with, all the human stuff on top of all the technical stuff.
And that human element, I think it's easy to forget about that sometimes.
Definitely. So if we were to sum up this whole deep dive, what would be the one key takeaway for our listeners?
That's a good question. I'd say the biggest takeaway is this. The next time you hear about some problem with shipping, like a port's backed up, or there's a supply chain issue, or even just a simple delay, think about those documents because it might all come down to a tiny error, somewhere in one of those documents.
So all this to say, accuracy and attention to detail really matter.
Absolutely. And I think it highlights how important those documentation professionals are.
The unsung heroes of global trade.
Exactly. They might not be the ones steering the ships, but they're the ones keeping everything running smoothly.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap things up.
It's been a fascinating deep dive, that's for sure.
It really has. But before we go, I have one final question, and it's kind of a big one.
Okay, hit me.
What does the future hold for all this? I mean, we're moving towards an increasingly automated world.
Right.
So will AI and machine learning eventually take over these tasks?
It's a great question, and I honestly don't know the answer. But it's definitely something to think about, Will there always be a need for that human touch, that ability to deal with the unexpected? Or will algorithms be able to handle it all someday?
Well, that's a conversation for another time, perhaps. But for now, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the world of export documentation. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.